But that deal was never intended to be a perpetual get-out-of-jail-free card. And when Gaddafi began this campaign against the opposition in his country, I think he forfeited whatever legitimacy, whatever limited legitimacy he had. And that then raises the question, what should the United States do in this context in the opening days of the crisis in Libya? Some people then said, let's establish a no-fly zone. For a number of reasons, not least of which helping to get expatriates, American citizens included, out of the country safely. The president did nothing. Had we acted in those early days, it could have tipped the balance conclusively against Gaddafi, and this whole thing might be over. Instead, the president did it, and he watched, and he waited, and he temporized. But because he's not able to stop talking, in the course of his ruminations, he said, Gaddafi's got to go. And then he still didn't do anything about it, thus exposing the United States to an enormous credibility problem with our friends and allies, as well as our adversaries, having said he wanted Gaddafi gone, but not taken any steps to make it happen. That's probably the worst outcome of all. And then, for reasons which are still not clear, he turns around and advocates a no-fly zone, which he waits for the UN Security Council to declare, rather than announcing it on our own. And by the way, the Security Council vote was 10 in favor, none against, 5 abstaining. You know who the 5 abstainers were? Russia, China, India, Brazil, and Germany. Now, this is the great diplomatic successor to the Bush administration? Are you kidding me? But what has happened with this no-fly zone is that we now have objectives that are utterly inexplicable. The president said today that it's very clear that our mission is to protect the Libyan people, and it's not to have a regime change to oust Gaddafi. Now, he's just spent the past month explaining to us that the biggest threat to the Libyan people is Gaddafi. So how exactly are you going to protect them and leave him in power? And if that is the objective, how are we going to do it without adequate American military assets? I think the answer here was provided by Ronald Reagan, as so many answers in both domestic and foreign policy. As we're going after the Libyan air defenses and creating the no-fly zone, let's not forget what our military calls, in a wonderfully euphemistic term, National Command Authority. National Command Authority in Libya is Muammar Gaddafi. And in a military operation, National Command Authority is a legitimate target. Just as Reagan struck in Libya after the Label disco bombing, unfortunately missing, let's try it again. This time we might succeed. That doesn't guarantee that Jeffersonian Democrats are going to replace Gaddafi in Libya. But this is the rare case where you say, on the one hand, you have Gaddafi, on the other hand, you have complete uncertainty. What do you choose? Choose complete uncertainty in this case. It cannot be any worse than Muammar Gaddafi. Now, that's not true necessarily elsewhere in the Middle East, and I think this is important to understand. I think we all hope ultimately for the democratic aspirations of people around the world. But let's be clear, you can have elections that produce illiberal outcomes. It's happened in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, where a Palestinian election brought Hamas to power. There's a risk of this happening in other countries in the Middle East too, and it's not a problem peculiar to the Middle East. Look at Russia. Here's a country that's passed out of totalitarian rule into democracy and is probably today passing right back out the other side of it. Democracy is not just holding elections and counting votes. Democracy is a culture. It's a way of life. It builds up over time. And so when we take the case of a country like Egypt, where an ally of the United States, who was certainly no Jeffersonian Democrat, Hosni Mubarak, is moved out of office, and we don't really know what's going to replace him there. That is a case where the unknown may well be worse than what we know. There is, however, consistency in the Obama administration's approach to Egypt, consistent with its approach in Libya, even more so. Obama had, by my count, 4 positions on Egypt before Mubarak finally fell. First, it was stable, he wasn't a dictator, then he had to go, then he should stay until September, then he should go immediately. I think Mubarak probably left because his head was turning too rapidly. To know what outcome we really wanted. And during this, we were treated to the spectacle of our Director of National Intelligence, Mr. Clapper, explaining that the Muslim Brotherhood is really a largely secular organization, rejecting al-Qaeda and eschewing violence. Until his office later corrected his testimony by saying actually he didn't mean that at all. So we should be happy that our top intelligence official is really up on what's going on in the region. Fundamentally, though, the big story in the Middle East remains the threat of Iran. And this is something that, as for the last 2 years, the Obama administration is simply not paying attention to. We see the conflict right now in the tiny nation of Bahrain. It's 70% Shia Muslim, 30% Sunni with a Sunni monarch. If you simply said, let's take a vote, there isn't any question who would win an election in that country, and it would be dominated instantaneously by Iran. So what is happening here is a confrontation in the Middle East between Persia, a Shiite country, and Saudi Arabia, a Sunni country, over who's going to be dominant on the Arabian Peninsula. This is not to say that the democracy is going to break out in Saudi Arabia anytime soon either, but they do, and the other monarchies of the Arabian Peninsula produce vast quantities of oil that are crucial to the global economy. Think about the implications of having Iran producing not only its own oil, but having hegemony in the Persian Gulf over all of the other oil-producing countries. The Arab states are petrified about the risk of Iranian terrorism, and the Iranians support terrorists of all manner. They support the Shia Hezbollah that has brought down the democratic government of Lebanon. They support the Sunni extremist Hamas in the Gaza Strip. They support the Muslim Brotherhood. They just were found out again by Israel capturing a ship called the Victoria carrying Iranian arms to Hamas in the Gaza Strip, which undoubtedly some of them would have made their way into Egypt. Iran supports terrorists in Iraq who are attempting to kill American soldiers. It funds and arms its former sworn enemy, the Taliban in Afghanistan, equally devoted to killing Americans and our NATO allies. And yet the administration has not done anything effectively to help the opposition in Iran to overthrow this government. We have done nothing in the last 2 years to stop Iran's continued progress toward nuclear weapons, except keep our fingers crossed for the Stuxnet virus, which did have an effect, but a limited one, on the Iranian nuclear weapons program. The risk that Iran is going to get nuclear weapons in the very near future remains high. And I'm afraid that the administration's position is simply that while they won't like that, that we'll be able to contain and deter nuclear Iran. I think that's fantasy. I think it's a badly misplaced analogy to deterrence during the Cold War. The rulers in Iran don't think the same way the Soviets did. And in any event, even if I were completely wrong about that, and it were possible to contain and deter a nuclear-armed Iran, it doesn't stop with Iran.